All right. You all will go ahead and get started while I'm doing this video. I am not sure, and I apologize that I can't get the video on right at this moment, but I will fix this as we go along. Um, but I wanted to get you all started and introduce you to Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Dr. Mustafa is the Vice President for the World's Wildlife Federation, as well as just a thought leader and, of course, a model for me in leadership when it comes down to this environmental justice work. I will let him introduce the panelists as well as have them introduce themselves. Helen Rose will hold down the hosting for me while this is going on with the technical, while I try to figure out the video and get the other panelists on. So I will let Dr. Mustafa take it from here and we'll get started. And Doc, I will get this video situation together while you're doing that, if that's okay with you.
That's fine, Reverend. And thank you. And I guess when they said the revolution won't be televised, they was telling the truth.
I know that's right.
But that's all right. That's all right. In the environmental justice world, you know, we persevere no matter what the situation is. So I just want to thank everyone so much. Being here with us on Earth Day. Also, you know, being focused on the issues that are happening in vulnerable communities, communities of color, lower wealth communities, on indigenous land, and across our great country. We know that there are some real challenges that are going on. There are systemic issues that have been going on almost since the founding of our country. But we also know that there's a pathway forward. And we are extremely blessed that we have some incredible folks who are doing just transformational work on the ground, making real change happen. And we're blessed to have them with us today, along with yourselves. So I'll just real quickly call out the names of our panelists, and I'll let them share with you here very quickly sort of their journey, how they got engaged on the issues that they are, why they are important, and why they continue to stay in the fight. So first, I'm going to start with Kaleia Martin. Kaleia Martin is with Climate Reality, but she also has worked with young people and is a young person herself for a long time. So Kaleia, are you on the line?
Can you hear me?
I can. If you want to speak just a little louder. So if you could just introduce yourself to the folks who are listening and who will soon be watching, and just sort of share with them a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So good evening, everyone. My name is Kaleia Martin, and I just think the technology today really didn't want us to be great, because 5 minutes before we were about to start, the place where I had everything set up perfectly, I had no no internet access whatsoever. So I had to scramble and kick my mom out of the office. So that was fun. So I'm glad to be here with everyone. I think to answer your question very simply, I always say this work found me. I didn't necessarily choose it. I never thought I was going to be working in the environmental justice and climate justice space. But over time, various people in my life planted seeds and got me curious around what it means, what environmental this means and how it impacts people. And then once you learn about that and you start learning about the ways that the climate is shifting and how that shifting climate is going to wreak havoc really on communities that have already been historically oppressed and excluded from a lot of things in society, it really pulled at my heartstrings. So I come to this work as someone who really is passionate about learning, is passionate about supporting people who have been neglected by our society for so long. And I'm just grateful to be here with all of you today and looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate you, sister. Next, we have Reverend Billy Michael Honor from the Georgia New Project. Reverend Billy, are you on the line?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be with you. I'm glad for the invitation and always happy to talk about important issues that affect all of us in beloved community. Thank you for the question. I am the director of faith organizer for the New Georgia Project, which is a civic engagement organization working primarily in Black and Brown communities, trying to connect faith communities, that's mosques, synagogues, and temples, with the tools and the resources that they need to build power in their communities to create positive social change. Really, we do our work at the intersection of theology, public policy, and community organizing. To that end, these issues that we'll talk about today around environmental justice issues, I specifically will talk about the relationship of voting rights and ending mass incarceration. All of those issues, though they seem in some ways different, have a common root. And that common root is what we work to try to identify, and that is the way in which our oppression, the common oppression in the human condition, continues to birth itself in so many ways. And so we try to give people the tools to fight that common oppression that continues to birth itself. And so I'm really glad to be in conversation today, because I believe that there's always something powerful and possible that comes together when we talk together and join together. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Rev. We appreciate you. And now we're going to move on to Dr. James Manuel PsyD. Doctor, are you on the line?
I'm online. I can't be seen yet because I guess the host disabled my camera. Can you hear me?
Hey, Doc, your volume sounds real low. Right now, we're trying to figure out the camera situation. Here's what I've done. I have, Billy, I just made you the host. If you would turn your camera on, then hover back over me and make me the host again. And I'll do that for every one of you all so you can get your cameras on. And then we'll go from there. I apologize for this technical difficulty, you all. And
That's
James, your volume was very low.
Very low. Okay. I'm trying to see if I can sign in on a different device.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll move on to Reverend Terence Lester, and then we'll come back to you if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Hey, grateful to be here. How's everyone? My name is Terence Lester. I serve as the executive director of an advocacy organization called Love Beyond Walls. We're based in Atlanta, Georgia. Specifically, we do narrative justice work around what it means to be without a home in this country and in the world. Specifically combating and deconstructing false narratives that persist about individuals experiencing homelessness and poverty. We also do proximity work with individuals, giving them and equipping them with the proper tools to actually transition out of homelessness. One of the things that we deem as important is a voice. We believe that there are no voiceless people. We just think that voices have been silenced. We also believe that visibility is very important to humanize the stories of individuals who have entered into this plight, all from different segues. But we also believe that access to housing is very important in rebuilding and reclaiming the broken pieces of your life. And so, yeah, we do all this to affirm the dignity of our brothers and sisters living out on the streets. And I'm grateful to be here to add my voice to this much needed dialogue.
Well, thank you, Rev. We need you more than ever with many of the issues that are currently going on. Let's go back to Dr. Manuel and see, Dr. Manuel, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Why don't you just share a little bit about your journey with folks?
Can you hear me any better?
We can hear you a little bit. If you want to project, we'd appreciate that as well.
Okay. So my name is Dr. James Manuel. I'm a licensed psychologist in Texas, Ohio, and Massachusetts. I'm the president and co-founder of Agape Psych Services. I'm generalist trained, so my practice serves a bunch of people from the public with many different mental illnesses, mental disorders. And I'm trying to spread it out, my theory and my practice style across the nation. And I feel like it's a good way to be open to anybody that has some mental health issues, anybody who's having life problems. Um, this COVID-19 stuff, this is like, I know a bunch of people with, germophobia and OCD are telling everybody like, I told you so. Um, and it's affecting people who don't have those disorders, people who are just depressed, people who are anxious, people who are just having regular life problems. Also, um, they have a new problem now, um, and this is affecting their work. It's affecting a bunch of people's income, um, and yeah, it's kind of a scary incident that we're having. Um, Maybe the most deadly of our generation, definitely, but in many generations um, before. So I'm here to talk about mental health perspective on this and on Earth Day.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. So let's go straight to our panel. Kaleia, we're going to start with you. Can you talk a little bit, because you have a vast amount of expertise on environmental justice and climate justice and climate related issues. Can you talk a little bit about some of the impacts that are happening in communities of color and lower wealth communities and on indigenous land?
Sure. And, I really appreciate the title for this panel being The Forgotten. Because for me, when I think about the forgotten, to me, it resonates deeply thinking about the communities you just mentioned. And I feel like this pandemic has really unveiled a lot of the gaps and a lot of the loopholes in our institutions that now millions of Americans are currently falling through and suffering from. But we know that historically, Black communities and Indigenous communities and other people of color, we've been falling through these gaps because these institutions were really never created for us. And I feel like we forget that as a society, that these institutions were created with a certain demographic in mind. And so thinking about the Indigenous people, our natives are the most forgotten population in this country. From the first day that European settlers arrived on this land, natives have been battling a crisis. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about the spread of diseases like smallpox that killed millions, the violent removal of natives from their own lands, and the fact that there have been over 370 treaties that the American government entered into with the natives of these lands, and that the US proceeded to break each and every treaty. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the forced migration to what the lands that we now call reservations, and the fact that our US government allowed the waterways of native communities to be dammed up so that they could no longer receive water that would help them grow their crops and sustain their traditional ways of life. And now today we think about their ongoing fight for the sovereign humanity as industries continue to try and threaten their lands with toxic industries like the pipeline. Native people specifically have endured so much violence and trauma and betrayal, and yet we rarely ever hear about their struggles. So I wanted to start with them and really lift them up in honor of Earth Day, because we know that they are the first people, and no matter how much this country tries to erase them, they cannot be erased. We cannot allow them to be forgotten. And so now turning to Black communities, the reality is that before we were disproportionately exposed to and killed by COVID-19, we were also disproportionately exposed to the coal-fired plants that contaminate our air and water and cause respiratory illnesses and cancer rates to skyrocket for our people living near them. We were also exposed to lead paint in millions of public housing units that Black families were pushed into living. We were exposed to lead in our pipes that turned our water into poison in places like Flint, Michigan, and all other cities across the country that are dealing with poisonous lead pipes. We were exposed to landfills that put toxic gases into the air that our children breathe in as they play outside. In places like North Carolina, we were exposed to hog farms in rural Black and brown communities that store tons of hog feces and urine in open air pits that leak into the groundwater, get sprayed into the air, and eventually flood out the communities during natural disasters. We were exposed to neighborhoods without trees, greenways, parks, and sidewalks, which create poor air quality, increased heat because there's nothing to absorb the sun's rays, and they created less safe conditions by having to walk on the side of busy streets. We're exposed to our communities being intentionally segregated in areas below sea level in places like Pontchartrain Park in New Orleans, where my grandmother's house sat underwater for 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. And I could go on and on. The point is that Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color have always been experiencing pandemics and crises for decades and centuries, and a lot of it has actually been government sanctioned. When I think about the forgotten during this pandemic, I think about the fact that many of us forget that no one is experiencing this situation in a bubble void of other factors. For many Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, this pandemic acts as an amplifier for the suffering and government neglect that many of us have been suffering through for decades and centuries. We must understand that Black people aren't dying because of poor choices, like our Black surgeons, general surgeon suggested a couple weeks ago. But really, all of the environmental injustices that I mentioned, the tons more that I didn't, really stamped sacrificial targets on the backs of our communities from the very beginning. And now we're seeing what that impact looks like in real time.
Sounds like you're sharing with us that in many instances that communities of color and Indigenous populations have been living in sacrifice zones.
Absolutely.
Well, let's move to Reverend Billy, because we just had a quick conversation about the environmental justice, environmental injustice, environmental racism impacts that are happening inside of our communities. But we also know that folks have been struggling to get the vote and then to be able to hold on to the vote, and some of the dynamics that play out in that. So Reverend Billy, could you walk us through some of the dynamics that are going on in relationship to the civic process?
Sure, glad to do so. I should begin by saying that when we talk about the issue of voting, in some ways, voting is a very localized process. You hear people say that local politics is the politics that matters, and I agree with that statement. But I also would like to talk about voting in the context of a sacred collective trust that all of us as citizens, regardless of what state or what city we live in, have to hold and defend. It is, in a real way, the thing that binds us together in whatever type of democracy that we find ourselves in. We don't have a system whereby we're able to make decisions on our own by majority rule. We elect representatives to go and make a great bit of decisions for us that matter for our lives. And to that extent, the civic process becomes a collective endeavor for all of us. And politics becomes something that all of us have to care about, to the extent that we care about goods and services, that we care about how it is that we get access to the things that we need, whether it be clean water, whether it be paved roads, whether it be breathable air, whether it be electricity, whether it be affordable housing, I could go on, a livable wage, etc. All of that are things that bind us all together because we all care about those things. So I want to say that. Having said that, I mean, we do have some very specific issues around voting that pertain to the South. There is a systemic effort to create a circumstance whereby people who could decide elections, that is Black and brown folks in many ways, get dissuaded from going to vote, period. And that is because there are those who realize that due to demographic shifts across the South, what we know is that the only way that particular parties feel that they can win is to either cheat, right, or to change the rules. Cheating, that is voter suppression. Changing the rules is gerrymandering. We see that all over the South. We continue to see it. Georgia will become, for instance, the state that I live in, the first state in the South to have a non-white majority. In 6 years, it will be the first state to have a non-white majority. They knew that 10 years ago. And then there were forces that kicked in that wanted to create a circumstance that would make it difficult for the demographic shift to affect voting. When COVID comes along, all of those issues get exacerbated. The issue of voter suppression that I could talk a lot about, but I won't take up the time. Issues of gerrymandering, that's representation. get exacerbated by the current situation that we have, when it is that now what's always been difficult was to get certain people to take part in the collective civic process because of some of the challenges that we've had, becomes even more difficult now when it is that it's a public health issue to even go out and vote in person. And so all of those issues are what are before us, without going into detail on any of them, just to let us know that this circumstance has presented a lot of challenges around voting, but it's also presented finally some opportunities for us to do some things that we probably should have done before by making it easier, not harder, for people to get registered and for people to cast their ballot. And I'll stop there.
Reverend Billy, if we could just unpack a couple of the terms that you shared, because we may have folks who are at different parts of their education in relationship to voting. So if you could just sort of share with folks around voter suppression, what does that look like? What does that mean? And then gerrymandering, what does that look like? What does that mean?
So voter suppression is the systemic attempt to either make people discouraged so that they don't vote, or if they do cast their vote, how do you get their vote not to count? That's the basic way. Now, there's several ways that happens. One is through poor administration, not properly resourcing polling sites. So someone shows up to that polling site, they have a short window that they can vote, because unlike in other countries, it's not a national holiday to vote, even though it should be. So you have to get to work oftentimes, but if there's a long line, you're probably not going to wait in that line an extremely long period of time, and then you're going to leave. So that's one way that it happens, through poor administration of actual administration of elections, lack of voting machines, which we have seen in many cases, old voting machines. Here in Georgia, until this very present election is coming up, the voting machines that we had were old enough to vote themselves. That's how old they were. They were 18 plus years old. And then voter suppression happens on the other end by when you have votes that are submitted and then they don't get counted, right? So this happens when you have things like exact match. So you signed up and you registered to vote, you had your signature, it looked one way, and then they received it, some board of elections committee that's been appointed sees your submitted ballot and they say, oh, this doesn't match. They throw it out, right? That was happening. How many of us sign our signature the same way every time, right? So that's happening. Also, use it, lose it is happening. That's another form of voter suppression, where if you don't vote in a certain number of elections, then they take you off the rolls. That was happening as well. You can have gym membership as long as you pay, and if you never go, nobody gives a damn. You can have a driver's license, and if you ain't driven in any point in the time of you getting that driver's license, you don't get your driver's license taken. They don't even bring you back in to make sure you still know all of the things that on the test that got you the license in the first place. But yet, when it comes to voting, they will take it if you haven't voted in the last 3 or 4 elections. These are all the ways that voter suppression happens. And gerrymandering, very simply, is when they look at a particular area and say that based upon the demographics in that area, there are either too many or not enough people to be represented by an elected official. And so they redraw the lines, right? And this is a historic way that both Republicans and Democratic parties have used to try to disenfranchise voters in areas that they don't fare well in. And so we certainly have seen that and continue to see it.
All right, Reverend Billy dropping some knowledge. I hope folks out there taking notes or sending in the questions that you might have as our panelists are sharing this incredible information with everyone. We're gonna move right now to Dr. Manuel. Dr. Manuel, have you rejoined us? Okay, Dr. Manuel may be having some difficulty there. So we're gonna move over to Reverend Terence Lester. Rev, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So we know that you have been focusing on those who some have labeled as homeless, but we know that you don't frame it that way. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that brothers and sisters across the country are dealing with in that space, and maybe also some steps forward?
Yeah. Firstly, I'd like to say that, from slavery to segregation, African Americans, Black and brown people have been systematically denied equal rights. and opportunities. Those affect the effects of those things have created discrimination to linger and perpetuate disparities in poverty and housing, and also healthcare, among other areas. These disparities in turn can contribute to more African Americans actually experiencing homelessness in this country. Poverty, particularly deep poverty, is a strong predictor of homelessness, and African American households are more likely to experience poverty than white counterparts. More than 1 in 5 African Americans actually live in poverty. That's 2.5 times the rate of whites. And when we talk about rental housing discrimination, Black families are more likely to live in areas of concentrated poverty, areas that have limited economic opportunities, fewer services, and poor educational resources. People who actually become homeless or experience homelessness are likely to have lived in these neighborhoods immediately before their homelessness. The data actually shows that African Americans oftentimes face more barriers when attempting to move to more favorable neighborhoods. We know history like redlining, where African Americans or Black and brown people were denied housing loans, and it was systematically structured where there was concentrated poverty that affected poor and brown folks, right? And so my work comes in when we start to criminalize and demonize and even form these false perceptions of what it means to be poor in this country, pertaining to any person that actually experiencing homelessness. I just so happen to work in more close proximity to a lot of persons of color actually experiencing homelessness in this country. And what I'm finding in this work is that policy, right? Every policy has a narrative storyline. Every policy has a hero and a villain, or a solution and a problem. At least that's how it's structured, right? And some policies and some ordinances have actually criminalized what it means to experience homelessness in this country, but also experience poverty. When the COVID-19 issue started to spread, many of our community members would often say, "I'm afraid that I won't be able to wash my hands during COVID-19 because I don't have access to running water. And if I do start showing symptoms, I have actually nowhere to go and get tested." And as we started to hear all of these fears bubble up in our community, it made me literally think that, people experiencing homelessness would be forgotten. We're talking about the forgotten. Where would they be able to go to wash their hands or get access to this basic human right of soap and water? How would they access testing when testing for the COVID-19 virus seems to only be given to individuals who have power and wealth and access, right? What about libraries that shut down? Many people experiencing homelessness oftentimes use libraries as ways to, access technology, use the internet, get information, use it as a way of survival, right? And we also started to realize that we started using this term social distancing, right? I don't even like that term. I like to reframe it as physical distancing. What we're doing is staying physically distant from one another so that we protect ourselves against the spread and contraction of the COVID-19 virus. But what I make that point is because people experiencing homelessness have been experiencing social distancing long before the coronavirus, right? Being ticketed and cited for sharing food, being ticketed and cited for sleeping in their cars, being ticketed and cited for standing in public places, the same public places that people with privileges and access would stand in and not be ticketed, right? There are some cities around this country that have laws right now that if you have 2 or 3 more bags with you carrying them, you could be cited for camping violations. And so this criminalization of what it means to be poor in this country has persisted for far too long. And I believe, just as the sister spoke about earlier, this crisis moment is revealing how the system has literally demonized and criminalized people. And so our organization has been advocating, one, to correct the false narratives that persist of what it means to be poor and experience homelessness in this country, but two, also educating people about the ways that everyday people can also step up and help save some lives. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Reverend Lester. I'd like to go back to Reverend Billy. Are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
So building upon, some of the systemic issues that continue to happen, we know that mass incarceration of Black and brown people has been a significant problem and continues to be so in our country. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In fact, my dear brother Terence is already opened the door to do so. Always good to be on the call with him. We longtime friends on this road for justice. And so I'm very happy he mentioned the criminalization of poverty because in many ways, so most people enter into the criminal the criminal legal system. We've been training ourselves not to call it the criminal justice system. The criminal legal system is through traffic violations, right? Most people would never have any contact with a judge or the legal system, the police, or anything if it were not for traffic violations. So one of the ways in which we criminalize poor people is that if they cannot pay these fines that happen across the board are the ways in which people begin to enter the system, begin to accumulate a file, etc. And then, of course, the ways in which Terence was talking about we talk about more abject forms of poverty in terms of people, just the way in which city codes are set up and ordinances and violations that also begin to criminalize people who are impoverished in various different ways. That's one part of this mass incarceration part that's very important that we talk about. But the other thing that happens when you have something like COVID is we talk about people who are already inside of the system who are incarcerated, right? Who been made invisible, right? Because of something that they did that we have deemed by our society to be inappropriate, and now they are incarcerated. And the problem with that is that there is this narrative, there goes that word again, right? There is this narrative that once you commit a crime and you've been found guilty, that it's permissible for the system to do whatever it wants with you, right? Because you brought that upon yourself. The problem with that is that opens the door for the infringement of human rights and for people to be punished in some ways triply or doubly in ways they've already received their sentence, they're serving their time. But then in this case of COVID, you've given people a death sentence who never were given a death sentence, right? Just because they are incarcerated, you won't give them the proper health care that they need, what we're seeing. They aren't getting the proper testing. We don't have eyes to monitor what's happening with a lot of our citizens who are incarcerated. And so many of them have been given a death sentence, even though that's not what they were given by the judge or by their conviction, right? But the narrative is that they don't matter. And we see that by the way in which the public policy comes out, the way in which these governor's orders comes out that aren't explicit about what should happen. So you talk about physical distancing. How does one physically distance themselves when they are incarcerated, right? How does that work? That's something that lawyers and advocates have been asking over and over again in states and counties all over this place. And we still haven't gotten a straight answer because the real truth is that we really feel like whatever happens to them, they deserve it. And we have to say that that's not right. And so that's where this COVID situation enters into the issue of incarceration and criminal justice reform, in addition to just the broader issue of how we just keep people out of the system altogether, which is another conversation I'm happy to have.
No, we appreciate that. And then we also know that we have both documented and undocumented brothers and sisters who unfortunately sometimes find themselves in these detention centers from the Latinx community and other folks who have come to our country. So we got to be mindful of that as well.
All the people who are, let me say this, all the people. So mind you, I'm glad you brought that up because there is also a segment who are incarcerated who haven't had a trial yet. Remember, we detain people off of, bail. And so we make people have to pay in order to get out of jail before they've even had a trial, right? And so people who have not been able to pay bail are being detained and they're in the jail, and they may very well be innocent, right? Now, some of the systems have let those people go, have let those citizens go free as they should, but not all of them. Some of them are being detained, and that's only because the system is greedy and it profits off of the back of poor people and people who can't afford an actual quality defense.
There it is. There it is. And we also know that people continue to build these facilities on toxic land and some of the most polluted land. For those of you who sometimes don't know the connection between environmental injustices and the incredible work that folks are doing to get brothers and sisters out of these situations. Reverend Malcolm, are you still with us on the line?
I am, Dr. Mustafa, and you've got a couple of questions here that I wanted to make sure I got before the panel. Naomi
Yes,
Bartley asked the panel, what do persons of non-color need to do or follow, represent in a particular way? She says she's taking notes. So what do not people of non-color need to do to follow or represent in a particular way?
All right. So let's start with Kaleia. Kaleia, would you like to take that first question?
Sure. Sure. So I think people of non-color, I'm going to assume that means a white person. So I'm making an assumption here. If that is what you mean, first, I think it's okay to name whiteness. That's really important in this work, whether we're talking about climate justice or working with any population of color. It's important that we are able to name race and talk about it. So just being comfortable naming whiteness, that's a good first step. The other thing I think that people can do, you suggested follow. I think that's a good recommendation, but I also think it's important that in the spaces that you're currently in, that you start having these conversations with your family members, with your friends, with anyone that you're fellowshipping with who is a white person. It's important that you are raising the alarms for them, instead of waiting for people of color to find ways to approach white people. It's important that white people are doing the work within their own racial group. There are some really great people that I think can really answer this question who are actually listening to this panel. So I'm going to call out folks like Amy Adams and Susanna Tuttle, who are some of my favorites, who have been doing environmental justice and climate justice work with a very strong awareness about what it means to be white in this space and trying to support people of color doing the work. So I also think reaching out to other white people who are doing this work the right way to get guidance and suggestions for them is a great step, in knowing that it's a process, it's a journey, but as long as you're willing to learn and willing to make mistakes and be forgiven, I think, there's always room for more people, and I'm glad that you're on this call, so thank you for being with us today.
Reverend Billy, could we have you also respond to that? And I believe I saw Naomi ask, what is the right way? And I don't know if there's any one answer, but I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'm probably the wrong person for this. And part of this is because I hold ordination in a majority white denomination, and so for the first several years of that, I was always called upon to come talk to white people about how they can be less racist. And finally, about 3 years ago for Lent, I gave up talking to white people about racism. That was what I gave up, and I said that white people need to talk to white people about racism, and I really do believe that, and I don't say that flippantly. I'm going to talk to our community. I'm going to talk to those who want to organize around creating social change, but we have to have interracial, intercultural conversations. And I think whites need to talk to whites about those issues because you all understand them best, and seek resources that are available. I really think there's so many resources that are available now to help understand the complexities of how white supremacy is birthed out of cultural imperialism, et cetera, and all of that, and the ways in which we can help to mitigate that and move towards more equitable systems. But those conversations are best had, I think, among people of common ancestry. And so I'll just shut up there.
Okay. Well, maybe there's also a psychological component to it, which we know that there is. Dr. Manuel, are you back on the line?
Yep, I'm back.
We'll let you, if you want to take a bite at that.
Well,
I just published a book on Christmas Day. It's called Universal System Theory. I want to like go over the first two assumptions of the theory. The first assumption is paradox. You know, paradox exists simultaneously in all things and all of us. And if you can picture the Chinese character for a crisis, the top of that character is danger. The bottom is opportunity. Anytime we're in a crisis, we have a dangerous time, but it's also an opportunity to be great. My company's called Agape. If you don't know what that means love, unconditional love, God's love. You know, anybody, white, black, yellow, brown, can give love. That's a part of our nature, a part of human nature. The second assumption is about the ways that we can interact with each other, ways that anything can interact with anything else. The ways are distance. So the social distance stuff is a way that we learn to interact, like we're doing right now. We're in different states, 1,000 miles apart, but we're interacting on this panel. I don't know where the people just viewing the panel are located, but I'm pretty sure they're not right next to me. But we're still interacting okay, even though the technology may mess up a little bit, we're still able to interact from a distance. You know, like two ships passing in the night. If you had a good enough tool to measure the waves, you'd see how they interact. The other way that we can interact is through collision. That causes damage, destruction on both sides or all sides. But the collisions aren't always the worst thing. So the crisis part, the danger part of that crisis causes destruction. But if we have a good plan for repair, then we can make ourselves bigger, better, and newer than we ever were before. But the third is like love. It's like the word I use is coalescence. So, you know, Naomi, any panelists, anybody viewing this panel, just be open to coalesce with others. You know, see some kids out late, ask for a ride, give them a ride. You know, see somebody homeless, give them $1, give them some money, buy them something. Don't worry if you're getting scammed. If you're open to being loving and coalescing with others, you'll win right away. You know, it's like donation, like charity. It shouldn't be like using a capitalistic framework. You know, it shouldn't be giving love, expecting return, expecting interest on that, on that return. You know, so the way we interact right now, it's a lot of collisions happening because people are taking things way too personal for me. You know, I sign off every time I see something on Facebook where people are just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because it's really kind of pointless to argue. You know, in debate, I never was on a debate team, but I watched them debate, and like there's always pros and cons handed out to each team, and there's support for both the pros and the cons. And so there's really no point in arguing unless you want to just see who can win in a debate. You know, because the truth and what's true and what's false, those are paradoxes. They exist simultaneously in all things. So, you know, for right now, we just need to look at the opportunities that we have. So we're distant from each other, physically distant, socially distant from each other. But we have the opportunity to meet via Zoom meetings, via, video or telephone. And I see that happening now. You know, my patients and people I talk to, they tell me that they reach out to their families, their loved ones way more now than they did before. That's an opportunity that they're taking. If you choose to not take an opportunity, that time is lost. You have to just wait till your next turn.
All right. Well, thank you, Doctor. We appreciate that. Hopefully all of us will take advantage of the opportunities to be authentic in our partnerships and in the work that we do. Reverend Malcolm, did you say we had another question?
Actually, I don't see another question in the box, but I'd like to follow up on that love piece and showing compassion. And I guess I would ask the panel a question of, in your various expertise, what do you see missing most in society's response to COVID when it comes down to showing love and being compassionate, in particular to your leadership? And now we are having questions. So after when you finish with that question, then we can ask some more.
And if we could keep that very concise in the responses, it would be helpful. Why don't we start with Kaleia?
So to briefly answer your question, I think I grasp what you're asking. To me, love looks like justice. And so we can do all the charity we want to do. We can, protest and take our picket signs out there and yell at people and tell people that they're doing it wrong. But to me, until we're at the point where we are changing policies, where we are able to greatly improve the quality of life for the people that we are next to in our society who have been intentionally excluded from opportunities, I think that a lot of the work that sometimes we find ourselves doing is about fixing fish, like making the fish more comfortable, whereas the issue is the water. The issue has never been people experiencing homelessness. It's been about a lack of opportunities in terms of economics and housing that has created environments where people are sleeping on the street. So I just feel like we have to really get down to the justice component. And to me, justice looks like large scale change that affects the lives of many people, not just the handful that we can give, the sandwich bags and all of the other good and useful things. Those are not sustainable. So we have to do more.
Reverend Lester?
Yes.
Did you want to respond to the question that was asked from Reverend Malcolm?
Well, I see a question here. I definitely agree with my sister. I think systemic change, we've heard it said that, love is what justice looks like in public. I truly believe that. I also believe that love looks like proximity. Oftentimes people develop false narratives about a population of people or a group of people because they haven't been proximate to them. And so I think love also looks like proximity. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And then there was a question also for you, Reverend Lester, if you could let folks know what that was and if you want to respond to it.
Yeah, so the question here is, the homeless here are every so often are rounded up and given hotel rooms, but they always end up back on the streets. Personally, I don't think hotel rooms are just the answer. It's just like the sister was saying, that is just a patch. Hotel rooms have expiration dates. I think we need to create more affordable housing. I think people can identify now, every single day since COVID-19 has started, we've seen an increase in new cases of people experiencing homelessness. One of the reasons why is because there aren't enough living wages, right? It's funny how people are dependent on essential workers that make minimum wages, but then when we're not in a crisis moment, we are protesting that they don't deserve $15 an hour in some parts of the country. And so I think we need to look at, as my sister said, the structures and systems that are set in place that prohibit upward mobility. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Reverend Malcolm, was there a question that came through on incarceration?
Well, actually, there's another question that came through in the Q&A from Dave Friedman with Elders Climate Action And his question, he says, he spent his whole life, a whole career, I'm sorry, working in human services. He even ran the homeless program, mental health and substance services and others. One thing that stands out is that when we have a crisis like we are in, all of a sudden we care. How do we get folks to hang on to the caring after the crisis is over and to build on for a better humanity?
Who would like to take that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, sure can. So when crisis happens, all of a sudden everybody starts caring. How do we maintain this caring after the crisis is over?
That reminds me of a marriage.
Okay.
There's always ruptures in every bond between people. The key is to repair. Have a plan for repair. And the best plan I know is to look back and think about what other people do for you, how they make you feel like yourself, how they make you feel like you're esteemed in society and loved in society. Keep that on your mind for much longer. That's the best way I know to maintain any new bonds, any new repairs, and to make them better. And hopefully the other people will keep that in mind too, as they watch you going out in public, showing that love and that care that you have, the compassion, empathy, that kind of inspires others to do the same.
All right, but Reverend Malcolm, I believe we got about 4 or 5 minutes left to go. If you don't mind, I'd like to pose a final question to all of the panelists, and I'll ask you to do the best you can to keep your answers brief. So if you had the opportunity to do 2 things that would help to transform and make real change happen on the issues that you focus on, what would those be? So I'll go to Kaleia first.
This is the one time I was like, maybe he won't call on me first for this one. That's a good question. I think if I could just do any 2 things right now, the first thing I would do is snap my fingers and pass the Green New Deal resolution. I just feel like that's such an important template for where I think we should go as a country. I know that it's a very intersectional vision for where this country can go in terms of the economy and how we treat people in our land. And the other thing I could do is also snap my fingers and eradicate racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, all of the isms, all of the things that are dividing us and making it harder for us to collaborate and see the collective imperfect humanity in each other.
All right, Reverend Billy.
Yeah, the first thing I would do is we would pass a comprehensive Civil Rights, Voting Rights Act, a new one, because Shelby versus Holder in 2013 basically gutted the one that was fought for in the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. And so because of that, we need a new one that takes into account the issues of voter suppression I talked about earlier. So we would pass that comprehensive and actually put in protections that would make sure that it can't be messed with again. And then secondly, what we would do is we would make it so that it would be unconstitutional to take anyone's voting rights if they committed a crime. I think to take someone's voting rights is like taking someone's citizenship. When they commit a crime, we're already punishing them. There are many ways that we have to punish people without taking their voting rights. And then when they get out, we tell them to get a job. They still don't have voting rights. That is taxation without representation. That's as unconstitutional as anything I've ever heard. So we would do that. Lastly, I'll say I'm glad to be here on climate on a day like this, on Earth Day, to talk about the climate, because none of these issues that we're talking about, livable wage, affordable housing, voting, none of these things matter if we don't have a sustainable Earth to live on and inhabit. Thank y'all for having me.
All right. All right. Dr. Manuel.
I'd say just make yourself more accessible. That's what I'm doing. I'm trying to be more accessible to my clients and to the public at large. And I recommend that all leaders do that. Every leader, if you're like a leader of the criminal justice system, go into prisons and talk to the prisoners. Don't sit around with the wardens, with the COs. Talk to the prisoners. If you hear the same story come out of 15 different prisoners about things that are wrong there, then that may make you be inspired to fix them. You have the power to do it. I can't snap my fingers and like click my toe or click my heels together and make something happen. I don't think any leader can do that, but you have to compromise with people who may be on the opposite side. And if you sit down and talk long enough, you can come to a compromise. The thing is that people like to stand up and just walk out before any decision has been made. So, be more accessible and sit down with your people that you are leaders of and find out what the real problems are.
All right. Thank you for that, Doctor.
Thank you.
Yeah, Reverend Lester.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would, I would launch a nationwide housing first model that will be low barrier housing for people experiencing homelessness. And two, I would do away with structural and institutional racism. Yep.
All right. Reverend Malcolm, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you all so very much. Thank you, Dr. Mustafa, for facilitating this discussion. Thank you to Reverend Billy Honor and to Kaleia, as well as Dr. James Manuel and Reverend Terence Lester. Not only do I thank you all for being on this panel, but I thank you all for being dear friends to me. For all our guests, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I offer to you all peace, love, and light. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
Good one.